NACDL is the association of the nation's criminal defense bar.
I want to thank everyone for joining us. Why don't we just go ahead and start with introductions? I'm going to go around and call on individuals just to introduce yourself, and then we'll sort of get into the discussion about what your organizations are doing and what work you're doing. So why don't we start with Emily, and then we'll go to Johanna, and then Kenitra and Kimberly.
Thank you, Monica, and thank you, NACDL, for having me today. My name is Emily Coward. I'm the project attorney for the North Carolina Racial Equity Network at the UNC School of Government's Public Defense Education group.
Thanks so much. It's really a joy to be here with you all today. My name is Johanna Jennings, and I am the founder and executive director of the Decarceration Project, which is a brand new nonprofit that I started last month in Durham, North Carolina.
And my name is Kimberly O'Neill. I am a founding member and the founding director of Power in Action. We are a Dallas-based advocacy group that mobilizes to advance Black communities in our region.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, NACDL, for this invitation. My name is Kenitra Brown. I am the staff attorney and director of engagement at the Deason Criminal Justice Reform Center at the SMU Dedman School of Law. And I am one of the founding members and a co-member of our Criminal Justice Board of Power in Action Dallas.
Thank you. So sort of the concept around this panel was to kind of get a look at what different legal practitioners are doing in regards to race in different ways that people have organized around particular issues. Some have been community organizing, others have been attorneys organizing. So there's a little bit of a contrast between these two groups, but there I'm sure will be some commonalities. So let's get started with Racial Equity Network. Why don't you tell us what the organization does and focuses on?
Sure, thanks, Monica. I'm really pleased to have this conversation with all of you today. So the North Carolina Racial Equity Network grew out of an effort that we put together many years ago. So the School of Government at UNC trains public defenders, the lawyers in the public defense education do that work in partnership with North Carolina Indigent Defense Education Services. And there had been a growing demand from lawyers who were working within this deeply racialized system for specific tools and strategies for addressing the injustices that they saw every day. And so as part of our manual series, our Defender Manual series, we put together a manual called Raising Issues of Race in North Carolina Criminal Cases with a team of advocates and advisors who helped us put that together. I co-authored that manual, and that's how I got involved in this project. When the manual was published in 2014, we realized that we wanted to do more than just publish these materials, but we also wanted to help build a community of advocates across the state who would really encourage and support and challenge each other to, to push these issues and to change the narrative inside our legal system and to highlight the injustices that are happening every day. And so we launched the Racial Equity Network, training a cohort of attorneys that Johanna Jennings was part of our first cohort who's joining us today. That was in 2015. That cohort studied together and worked together and learned together for about 18 months. Then we trained up a second cohort. And now we kind of put on programs for both graduates. There's over 100 MC-REN graduates across the state, and we train them to be leaders in their communities. And there's local groups around the state that address issues of racial equity in the criminal justice system in their own local jurisdictions that I support as well. So it's kind of grown from its original purpose, but that's a little bit of background as to what we do and how we got started. And we're moving in some new directions beyond the defender community as well, but I think that's a good description of just kind of, the basis of the foundation of this work and how we got it off the ground. And it has been foundation supported from the Z. Smith Reynolds Foundation since its inception.
Thanks, Emily. And Johanna, how did you sort of get involved in this process?
Yeah, I got an email. Basically, I was an assistant public defender at the time in Greensboro, and I got an email saying that they were recruiting a cohort or group of people who wanted to learn about racial justice work and how to use litigation tools to litigate a lot of the racism and systemic issues we were seeing. And it was, at the time, just a very different world. We saw racism all the time in our cases, and it was incredibly frustrating. We talked about it all the time as an office and, just around the lunch table and how frustrated we were. But none of us in our county and none of the private attorneys in the county, no one was talking about race in the courtroom at the time. I think by the time I got recruited to the cohort, Michael Brown had recently been killed. It was the very inception of the Black Lives Matter movement. And I think maybe it was like a holdover from the times where being, not seeing race was like the anti-racist way forward, or that's how we were taught growing up. And so it's almost hard to remember why we weren't bringing this up, but it was a no-brainer when I saw an opportunity to get from the place of just having these frustrations to the place where I could actually try to do something about them. It was a no-brainer to sign up and get that training and become part of that community. And it was a really amazing opportunity. It's shifted my practice in a major, major way.
That's really interesting that you kind of started out with just a seed, an idea, and how massive it's grown since then. I want to turn over to Power in Action because they had a similar start in just being responsive to the issues that are happening in their communities and taking action. So why don't we talk about how you all got your start in Power in Action?
Sure. So I'll start off and probably hand it off to Kenitra, but during COVID, so it was last April of 2020, I believe it was, when Dr. Francois Booker-Drew, she's the VP of Community Affairs for the State Fair of Texas, got a call from one of the Dallas City Council members, Casey Thomas, and said, at that time, we started hearing a lot of data about the Black and Latinx communities being disproportionately impacted by COVID. And so Councilman Thomas wanted us to get ahead of that. What does this look? We never thought we would still be where we are as it relates to COVID. And so he wanted to get ahead. What do our communities look like after we're finished with this pandemic? And so Dr. Booker-Drew brought together 52 leaders. So we are a variety of leaders in terms of Power in Action, just to come together to begin to some form of ideation around how do we focus and really address the community around economic development, around education, around community outreach and communications, criminal justice, and education. So education, economic, and policy and advocacy. And when we got together, it was really just organic. To this day, we've never met in person. Everything that we've done since April of last year has been done virtually. And we really started just talking about and doing some ideation about workshops and utilizing our individual powers. Everyone in our Power in Action, we have a group from a giving circle, Heritage Giving Fund. I'm a founding member of that, has been brought to the table. We have executives in corporate America, in the nonprofit sector, and in municipal management. We all bring a host of collective services. We are multi-generational as well. And we thought that was important to ensure that we were able to tap into all parts of the community. But then something happened as we were talking about how do we get ahead of COVID in terms of what does after COVID, and we didn't have a name. We just called ourselves the after COVID-19 group. Like that's literally what our name was. But we sat back and then George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery happened. And I remember the heaviness of the very next virtual meeting after both deaths. And we sat there and said, this is bigger than COVID. This is bigger than what we are seeing. All of this intertwines in some way. And we knew that we would be in this for the distance, and we really didn't know what it was going to look like, but we knew that we needed to form in some sort of structured organization. So we're now a fiscally sponsored 501c3 under More Impact, which is based out of Denver, Colorado. that allows us to tap into the capital that we need. And so there's just been this iteration of resources over the past year, a little over a year now, in terms of what is it that we can do for the community? How do we bring all of these resources together? How do we bring all of our different brain power and intellectual capital to the table in efforts to better our communities in Dallas? And I'll be honest in telling you that it has been difficult at times. Because we're still running every organization that we were running before we got together. And that we also have to be very, very careful and respectful of the differences that we do bring to the table. We have people that are fighting for racial and social injustice, and we have police officers. We have attorneys. We have people that are entrepreneurs. We have elected officials. And so as we are doing our work, we also have to be very cognizant of what everyone is doing outside of our immediate group, because we want to make sure that we're not putting anyone in an awkward position, that they're not losing opportunity, and also that we are setting people up for success, and that we're not watering down the hard work that all of our members are doing in the community. So that is the essence of how we got started.
Okay, and I get pulled into the group right around the time when everyone realizes what happens with George Floyd is heavy. There's already, I'd already been in conversation with Dr. Fossil Drew about issues around criminal justice in Dallas already. There was already a concern coming from different organizations in Texas about the number of people who were in the Dallas County Jail. Even in my professional space, we were launching a campaign basically called "Let Them Out." It was basically to find people who were in jail on minor charges or technical violations and letting them out, because we, by that point, by April and May, we already knew that jails and prisons were hotspots. So the idea was, how do we address, like on the ground, getting people out of pretrial detention against an executive order that made it harder to let people out of prison if they had a former charge involving assault, no matter how far back it was, or if their current charge involved an assault. They couldn't get out except for on a cash bail. They couldn't get out on their own recognizance. So there's all this discussion happening about the jails being hotspots, up against this really, really urgent. There's an urgency to address racial reckoning, and especially criminal justice. So I come into the group as just part of the criminal justice portion. And we had a really formidable person already in that space. That was Richard Miles, who was an exoneree. He was arrested for a murder that he did not commit when he was 19 and spent years in prison before he was able to get exonerated. And he had exculpatory evidence available to his defense team at that time. It just wasn't used. So we already had really formidable people on this committee. So my invitation in was obvious, because at the time we were also in the public defense space. There's a larger conversation happening around holistic public defense, that we're making sure, or it's easier for not easier, but it's necessary, or it's more effective when public defense attorneys or when private defense attorneys know how to find wraparound services for their clients in their communities. They know who they can go to if they're having issues with housing, with transportation, with reentry skills, with finding employment, with finding ways to get around the city. Dallas is not a particularly transportation-friendly city, despite a public transportation system. So knowing that all of those systems were connected, what we mean by systemic, it meant that turning down an invitation to work with this group on how to address criminal justice issues, along with the other systemic issues and these other systems and institutions that were happening in Dallas, we couldn't turn that down. And so this became a conversation about how to address these urgent conversations that were happening in Dallas, and also to address really on the ground what was happening with people who were actually in places, or in jail and trying to get out, or any of those things. Like, how are we helping people on the ground right then, because we were in and still in the midst of a truly deadly pandemic that was particularly affecting those that were Black or Latinx on the front lines.
And that's really an interesting point that that both groups sort of made, is that in some ways the death of a Black man or Black person in the community sort of put a fire to the flame and made people want to mobilize. And sadly, it continues to happen, but it seems like there becomes sort of fertile ground for change or people seeking to do something about it. So I want to turn to Ren and find out, attorneys can be sort of rigid in thinking of the way things are. So how can you sort of mobilize around an issue like, police brutality, for example, or just any types of systemic racism to move the needle forward in the courtrooms and beyond?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that, part of what I try to do, because I know this work is hard and there's vicarious trauma that is taken on by the attorneys that are trying to do this work as well. Highlighting successes and really also explaining the dire consequences of inaction is a big part of it. I don't know if you know Twyla Carter with the Bail Project, but she's really shaped my thinking around, if you're an attorney, a public defender who's representing clients of color in this deeply racist system, and you can't address these issues, it's really ineffective assistance of counsel, right? And so we have to think about how to make it, how to give practical, tangible tools that people can actually think through. I can see how this is going to get both a better outcome for my client and contribute to potentially over time some culture and system change as well. So, it's around looking for strategic opportunities to be a part of seeking reform in our case law by litigating claims, and supporting initiatives that are led by justice-involved individuals, knowing who those groups are in your communities so that you can understand what the concerns and the agendas are of community-based groups. And then looking for ways to partner with other court actors to really try to reform policies and practices across the board in the system. And I don't know if that was really directed more at me or at Johanna, but those are some of my initial thoughts in response to that question.
Johanna, did you have anything to add to that?
Just to add the obvious, which is that this is a system that's built to perpetuate and uphold white supremacy. And so we won't, we do need to continue to operate within the system for reform. And at the same time, we need to always have the bigger picture in mind that this is not a system that's ever going to work for people who are disadvantaged or under power, have less power in our society in any way. And so looking for, looking towards people like prison abolitionists, looking towards community organizers who are thinking more creatively and who are not trained to be rigid, like you said, and trained to just maintain the status quo like we often are in law school. Looking to those people who are more directly impacted and are more proximate to the problems and therefore can be more proximate to the solutions. So just really keeping an open mind and continuing to keep a pulse through, following BIPOC people on social media who are involved in this space, by really lifting up and listening to the voices of people who are directly impacted, so that you don't get kind of stuck in your day-to-day fire putting out in the court system. I remember reading an article one time about some, I think it was some Black Lives Matter. No, it was the people who pulled down one of the Confederate statues in Durham, and they had pulled it down, and some people were arrested, and they were having misdemeanor trials on whether they were guilty of X, Y, and Z misdemeanor. And, the judge said, well, based on what you're saying, you just think we should just tear the whole courthouse down. And the people in the courtroom were like, well, yeah, that's exactly what we're saying. And, as lawyers, sometimes we're like, tear the courthouse down. How could that? But we just have to continue to be really open and creative and following the lead of the people who are able to more effectively come to solutions and do this brainstorming. And just, one piece of that certainly is restorative justice. That's one model we can look towards.
And so I'm sure you all know that lawyers are not a monolith, criminal defense lawyers are not a monolith. How do you generate the buy-in around litigating issues related to systemic racism? Some people may say, this is not going to help my client if I try to use the race card every time I come into a courtroom. So what do you say to the lawyers that feel that I can litigate this Fourth Amendment issue without talking about, the racist police? What ways can you move the criminal defense world forward in terms of building consensus around certain ideals? Like, maybe you can do both.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we're always trying to, respond to the objection that it can't be done with examples of it being done. Bringing people in who are litigating that equal protection challenge right alongside that Fourth Amendment motion to suppress. And showing how the two types of claims can strengthen one another. I also like to make sure that people understand that when people get discouraged in the face of bad case law, like in North Carolina, we've never had a successful Batson challenge on the merits. There's never been a appellate ruling in North Carolina finding discrimination against a juror of color, which is crazy given the statistics in North Carolina about how jurors of color are struck at over twice the rate, and oftentimes far more than that, than their white counterparts. And I think that Johanna, who litigates that issue quite a bit, would say that partially that's just because defense attorneys haven't been raising it, right? So a lot of times I think that the most powerful response to concerns that this isn't worth it and playing the race card is going to backfire is, what's backfiring is what we're doing every day. What's backfiring is not standing up and calling out what's happening in our system. And so I think that, highlighting successes, showing opportunities where they exist, and really focusing on the dire consequences of doing nothing is the way that I have found that those would, and also trying to call people in rather than call people out. I mean, I think that a lot of times just making sure the conversation doesn't get too personal, but that is structural is really helpful as well. That's what I have found.
I'm just going to take a quick question from the audience just because I think it's somewhat related to what you just said, Emily. And the question is, since increasing penalties based on criminal history is a driver of racial disparity, are the panelists familiar with effective efforts to challenge the use of criminal histories in sentencing? And I just thought maybe you'd have an idea of whether there's been successes around something like that.
It's an excellent question. It's certainly something that I have consulted with lawyers who want to bring that to light, that they want to put their, in an individual sentencing hearing, they want to put their client's life in context and explain how over-policing has led to their criminal history record in terms of case law and in terms of anything that I can point to that would be helpful as legal authority. I'm not super aware of anything that comes to mind, but I would love to be directed to any of that authority or experiences that other panelists or other folks in the audience might have.
Just really quickly, I know there are people working on, people in the sentencing process, different people working on federal and state levels to adjust sentencing and draconian sentencing for certain things. But I will admit, in my personal practice, I had some success with some clemency and commutation petitions around criminal histories. One, the memo around during the Obama administrations, during their clemency push, the memo that Eric Holder published around these issues made it easier to discuss how criminal histories were applied then. It was easier for us to make arguments that some criminal history should not have been counted in the federal sentencing guidelines because either, they were not a felony in the state law, and so should not have been put in a federal criminal history as a felony count, or they had been, or retroactive drug laws had been applied since then. And under those retroactive rules, this criminal history wouldn't be what it is when they went into prison. So there are people working on this in smaller spaces, or, but I don't know that there has been any formal ways, but I will say what a lot of attorneys say, and I always hear from Brittany Barnett, who does this kind of work, is if it's wrong now, or if it's changed now, it was wrong then, and it should be automatically retrospective now, or automatically retroactive now. So there are people advocating, and there are attorneys and organizations advocating for these changes. I think for a lot of people, they're seeing if it can happen federally, then it's an easier job pushing state reform around sentencing practices. I will admit that I don't know if it's better to go state to federal or federal to state, but I think most people think if federal guidelines change, so goes the states. But it's happening. I think people are aware, and I think a lot of people are talking about, looking at ways to address even retroactive relief around sentencing guidelines.
And Johanna's doing a lot of work around getting relief for people with extreme sentences. And there's some unique avenues in North Carolina for doing that, Johanna, maybe you could just mention quickly.
Yeah, one of the things I've been spending a lot of time on recently is petitions for this board that they've created to review people who are sentenced as juveniles or as teenagers who received extreme sentences. So they've served 15 to 20 years or longer, and they're still in prison. And what I'm seeing is that there's just so much racism baked in at every piece of that even though North Carolina is 60% juveniles in North Carolina are 60% white, what we see is that 91% of juveniles who are serving excessive sentencing are juveniles of color, and 80% of those are Black. And when you look at their record prior to that charge for which they were tried or sentenced as an adult, when you look at their the amount of charges that they were charged with for the same behavior as the white person, so getting stacked charges and boxcar charges. And then when you look at their infraction history, like you get infractions for things like disobeying order, or obviously things that are just incredibly problematic given our 400-year history of trying to control Black people, and these things all make someone look like a worse candidate. And so what I'm seeing and having to call out kind of in these meetings right now is that these metrics that we're using are just so racist that inevitably the white candidates arise to the top of the pack, looking like the best candidates for relief. And that I think, sentencing is very much related to that in terms of someone's criminal record, in that you just can't unpack all of the different racist pieces of it. So many people plead guilty to felonies, their initial first couple of felonies, because they want to get out of jail and they can't afford their bond. And so once you've, pled guilty, the prosecutors know the drill. They know, lock somebody up, get them to plead to felony number 1, lock them up again, get them to plead to felony number 2. And by the third time you lock them up, you can hold a really long jail sentence over their head because they're habitual in North Carolina and lots of other states. So yeah, absolutely a huge problem. I think we have to start, a lot of what I talk about is we've got to start focusing on violent crime reform, because there's a lot of people talking in the space, and it's a very important space to be in, of misdemeanor reform, drug reform. But the reality is that so much of violent crime is a result of, a lack of kind of opportunities, almost a systemic buildup of lack of opportunities, and that the victims of violent crime are often the perpetrators one day and the victims the next. So most of my clients, or virtually all of them, have been victimized. So I think we just need to start seeing, looking at literally every step. What is your record? What is your jail record? And just thinking about the racial implications of that.
And if I can add to that, as the person on the panel that is not in the legal profession, I am a former city manager. So my view and holistic view on community comes from a very different place. But as Johanna was talking about, in terms of what the legal field can do, to shift things forward, I think it's very important. Kenitra and I had this conversation last night about we are not working in a silo. It's not just the legal field. It's not just community. And that's why an organization like Power in Action can be extremely powerful. But the one thing over the past year that I've been trying to highlight through our work has been that we have to be very careful of the organizations that are pro criminal justice reform and the training and the narratives that they're sharing, because sometimes the narrative that they're sharing that supposedly is supposed to move conditions in the right way actually are extremely harmful. That they're not positioning people when all of the work that we're collectively doing, that there are people on the street in terms of other community organizations that are really for the work. And then you really listen to what they're saying. You really look at their outputs and their outcomes, and you realize it's actually counterproductive to everything that we're doing. And so when we're looking at, what can prosecutors do? What can folks within the legal field do in support of the work that we're talking about today? We have got to look at all of the pieces that contribute to a case getting in front of it into the criminal justice system, because there's so many people that are not there for the right reasons. And it is making it extremely difficult for us to help move community members forward, especially after they get to the point when they're out and they're trying to move on with life. They're returning citizens, and we have organizations that are supposed to be helping that are counterproductive, and what they do is make it more difficult for people to move forward because they're always reminding them of what has happened in the past.
That's an excellent point. And Kimberly, can I ask you, since your experience in doing so much community organizing, what role does the criminal legal practice, criminal defense attorneys have in community organizing? Is there a role? Should they take more instruction from community members? What's your view on what role, if any, the criminal defense bar would have in community organizing?
I think there's a collective conversation. Because if we're talking about justice, we're not just talking about prosecuting people that have been arrested. We're talking about ensuring that the right person or the right people are being prosecuted fairly for the crimes that they may have committed. Right. And so we see so much, and we've seen it around the country. There's this movement to just close a case, get someone tried, get someone convicted for a case. There's a collective conversation that needs to happen. And we were talking yesterday also, last year, there's a legal organization here in Texas that actually, it was a half-day session. And they had prosecutors, district attorneys come from some of the area counties to talk about what they are doing differently. And it was the most refreshing thing ever, because it was about justice, right? Because if you try and convict the wrong person, then we still have the wrong person. We have the right person, but the wrong person still on the street. And that's not helping community in even more. We have to have more open dialogue. We have to have more conversation. We have to listen. We have gotten to the point, I think, collectively from many angles when it comes to organizing, we get so frustrated with this frustration with the frustration of not moving forward, that whatever little bit of relief we think that we're getting, we kind of run with it. But we also don't pay attention and talk to and really listen. I think, Emily, you mentioned earlier, in terms of something about, and I don't want to misquote you, but in terms of how can we present the information? How can we present when we may be at odds with an approach? But can we have the conversation? And can we have the conversation where it's not personal, where I may believe in something that's so strongly in one direction that you're not going to take it out on the people that I'm trying to help because you don't like the way that I presented it. And we have got to get past that point. And I think if we really listen to the community organizers that are on the ground, and that's another point of frustration for me specifically, we have many people that are on the ground, have been doing this, have never been paid, probably won't be paid, never get any type of funding, taking funding out of their own pockets. And I always say we're changing community and trying to help people get out of poverty by creating more poverty, because that's how it's getting funded, by the people who really can't afford to do it. But then I look at the people who are supposed to be changing, that are getting the investments, $250,000, $500,000, and I look at what they are presenting, and it's nothing. It's nothing. So from a community organizing perspective, it's time for us to have hard conversations about, do we want assimilation or do we want justice, respect for culture, and change? Because if it's the latter, what we're doing right now collectively throughout this country is not the right way to go. But we have to respect culture. Your way of doing something may not be right for my community, but why is it wrong for my community to approach it in that way? Why can't we have those different types of conversations? Something you might not like, it's not criminal. You just don't like it, but it's not criminal. And we're moving in that direction. So we have to have more hard conversations with community organizers. We have to listen to community organizers. And then we have to honestly accept the fact that there are community organizers who may be more grassroots. There might be people that are sitting at the table that are really focused on policy. And then we have the people that may be in the seats that can make the change. No one group is better than the other. It takes all three groups in order to make things happen. It's the ones that bring awareness, the ones that negotiate, and the ones that have the power to make the change. And that's where we really need to be.
And so I'm just going to ask all of you, and you all can jump in. How do you set priorities? You have these competing interests, competing views as to what needs to be addressed. I think, Johanna, you made a great point that violent crime needs to be addressed, but then there's a huge push now to address misdemeanor cases, because that tends to be where people have the most contact with law enforcement. So how do you set agendas and priorities with organizations and coalitions that all pretty much want the same thing, but maybe have a different view as to what needs to be prioritized? And you can all jump, whoever wants to jump in first can go ahead.
I'll say who's really focused on change? Who's really talking about the outputs and the outcomes that this change can result in? Who are the people that quite honestly are shaking the table? And it doesn't have to be in a loud way, but who's making people uncomfortable? And then ask yourselves, why is it making people uncomfortable? Because typically there's something that needs to be adjusted in some particular way. I think for us, even internal to our organization, education starts inside for us. Every time we go out to do something, the one conversation that we typically have is, are we doing exactly what we are complaining about? Or have we asked the community, which is often a piece that, have we asked the community what they want and what they need? And if we haven't, that is our first step. Second step is to make sure that we understand the culture of the communities. It doesn't matter if the common denominator in Power and Action is that we are all Black, but we are all not from the communities that we are directly serving. Some of us are transplants to Texas, transplants to North Texas. Some of us are at executive levels, maybe Gen X and baby boomers. Some we have that are millennials and Gen Z. We have a plethora of people. We have cops in Power and Action. We have executives in higher education. We have some hard conversations that are very uncomfortable inside, which also means that we are a fraction and a representation of what's happening outside in the community. And if it's hard for us and we find ways to adjust and talk, it means that it's possible, but it means that it has to be very intentional. And I believe that older people can't just discount younger generations. Because there's something that they really are interested in. And I think every voice is valued at the table, but we have to really talk about and pay attention to the different people, the different groups, and what everyone is bringing to the table. And when it's uncomfortable, we can't just walk away from it or push people out because we don't want to deal with it, because not dealing with it means we're not ready to truly address systemic issues.
And I'll follow up there, like practically speaking. When we first came together as a group, again, the concern was, what are we addressing once we're out of this? We never got out of this, and we're still in it. So there were some really heavy priorities, like the world had to keep moving. So the legislative session came. So that it became about, in this legislative session, what do we need? Or what is this community looking for us to address? We couldn't lobby, but we could make people aware of what was going on in the legislature, what groups were doing. So that public awareness part of that. We knew that there was this misinformation going around about COVID itself and vaccines. So we did programming around, we have a health committee. We did programming and on the ground work around getting people better information about COVID and the vaccinations. There like the priority became, the way we started doing priorities after a certain point became, what's frustrating these communities from moving forward? What's keeping things from happening, or where people are having the biggest problems? And that became about, what's COVID knocking down? What's happening in these legislative sessions around these policy issues, including around criminal justice? And that, frankly, since we've started, we're still a baby group since we've started. Those things are kind of what set the agenda, but it's like Kim said, we were doing this keeping in mind that a lot of us were hearing things from different corners of communities. And this is what's important over here, this is what's important over there, and then this is what's happening in the larger system. Because again, we had a council member of the team who's, actively discussing what's happening or what the city's concerned with. So a lot of the agenda was driven by what was happening, again, on the ground. So there are these larger issues happening that we have to keep talking about. There's these larger systemic issues, which we have to address. But we also have to address that there are people on the ground being hurt by misinformation or a failure to, like, what can we do to get around these things that we can't change right now? We're not going to change, the law's not going to change right now. How do we save some people? Or how do we get some people? Or how do we get information out there about what's about to happen so that we can make some movements, move some things forward, at least in the next year or two?
Any thoughts from Ren on how you set your priorities as a group in terms of what should be addressed first or what's most critical and important?
Yeah, sure. I mean, so we took this position. Can you all hear me? We took the position that, as Johanna said, every stage of the criminal process is deeply racialized, and all of them contribute sort of cumulatively to the unjust outcomes that we see. So when we put together REN programs, we really try to focus on every stage and providing tools for every stage. Beyond that, in terms of what to focus on for publications or for webinars, I think we're trying to balance a lot of different things. We're trying to not, duplicate the efforts of groups that we partner with. So if there's a lot of programming for capital defenders, we don't really do capital work except for in partnership with others, kind of, supporting other efforts. And then we try to be responsive to the demands of movement organizers who maybe contact us and request assistance with supporting reform-oriented sheriffs, or something along those lines that maybe wasn't on our radar, but that we're getting a request for assistance from. And then if we see, strategic opportunities for a change in the law that might be happening in other states, but hasn't really hit North Carolina yet, we see our role as really lifting up examples of maybe there's some really exciting change going on related to how courts are treating cross-racial eyewitness identification in New Jersey, and we want to lift that up in North Carolina and get people to file those motions and to look at it from that point of view. So it's sort of a balancing act, but we try to do a lot of listening and being aware of who else is doing this work in different lanes, so that we're not stepping on people's toes, but that we're working, in harmony and complementing efforts that are already going on in the communities.
I know, Johanna, you were trying to jump in there, so I just want to make sure you had a chance.
I'll just co-sign. And I'll just, suggest that one thing Emily and I think a lot about is that for a long time, judges and lawyers were supposed to be kind of the most prominent people in the courtroom. And what we know now is that's just completely wrong. And so, we see ourselves as having some skills and knowledge that we can bring to help people who are more directly impacted with their agendas. So often it's not prioritizing for us or agenda setting for us, but more looking at what other people's agendas are and seeing the ways that we can support.
Great, thanks. So I want to turn to Power in Action and ask you both to talk about, how does your background inform the way that you participate in this organization?
I think all of us, we come to the table with our current experiences and all other experiences that we've had. I'm a former city manager. I've managed the operations for one of the largest municipal courts in the state of Texas. I have lived from all up and down the East Coast. And so I bring a plethora of experiences from the nonprofit and the municipal government arenas. And so it allows me to analyze a lot differently. I've been doing this work for 30 years, so I can spot things very quickly where someone else who may not have my experiences may not be able to do that. But then someone else in Power and Action may be able to spot something a lot differently than I can, because of, honestly, sometimes the length of service could be a disservice to me. Because I may not have been as connected to more of the grassroots work in my recent years. And so I think we all bring something very different to the table, and it allows us to, I think, focus on root causes a lot differently, not just kind of categorizing everything as systemic issues, but what are the root causes of the issues? And we have some amazing and dynamic people throughout our organization that, I mean, you could literally just sit on the floor and just learn from them. And I think that's one of the benefits that we have, that we oftentimes don't need to go out and do a lot of research, because the research has already been done in everyone's individual current professional spaces. We're all volunteer in terms of the work that we do. And I will say this, we're non-negotiable in who we are and what we do. And that is an important part, because we do have to factor in what everyone does outside of the organization. But we had an example starting the end of last year to the beginning of this year, where they were we had given a lot of feedback on a racial equity project in the area. And through that racial equity project, we started saying, you can't put all Black people and Latinx people in the AAPI community and the Native American community in the same room for the first time, because everyone's issues are different, and that is unfair. And so we finally got that across, and they started putting together a coalition for the Black community. They came back and said, well, everybody that we want to be a part of it is already a member of Power and Action. And with that, when they recognized that, instead of saying this is a wonderful thing, they decided to abandon that concept and focus on corporate America and racial equity and systemic change. And so if we're really paying attention to root issues, we know that we're good at what we do individually, and we're very powerful together. And I think to that extent, I think there's so much power from that professional aspect and Power and Action. If I don't know it, someone else does. And if 3 of us don't know it, 10 more probably do. And I think that's the beauty of who we are and how we're positioned to impact work. But more importantly is that we also look at who's already doing the work that has nothing to do with our organization, and how do we ensure that they're amplified and elevated in the community even before us. And so Kenitra and the Criminal Justice Committee, that's a whole nother set of awesomeness for us. And it's honestly something that we truly needed. So Kenitra was an amazing addition to our team as well.
Hi. So I am born and raised in Dallas proper. I am the daughter of a formerly incarcerated father, and he went to jail when I was pretty young. He did not get out until I was well into college. And he wasn't the only one. I grew up in Dallas. It's interesting if you look up statistics. There's of all the major cities in the country, it has one of the largest wealth gaps. It is naturally, it's organically segregated. It still is. And I grew up in basically South Dallas, in what's then a segregated portion of the city. And all the men, and then around the time I became a teenager, a lot of women, being disappeared or basically being arrested and going away and never coming back to the neighborhood. Really just, it always felt insidious to me. It always felt wrong. And then of course, you guys know when you grow up and your parent is in prison, that's a lack of resources in your own household. But if they're all gone in the community, that's an entire community that lacks labor, capital, and power. And so all of that informed how I grew up, why I wanted to go to law school, all of my experiences coming into coming into the law, in fact, and then coming into the group. And then by the time I got into law school, and by the time I'm really starting to look at this from this legal education, from a stance of legal education, Dallas was one of the cities in the nation with the highest number of exonerees. And that should tell you something about how Dallas was doing justice in the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s. And so coming into the group with that knowledge and having grown up in Dallas, and kind of with the sentiment of how a lot of us felt about moving around in certain spaces in Dallas, who got to speak, who had power in which places, all of that had a lot to do with how we deal with issues, hear each other, why we're multi-generational, because some of us took up different spaces and places in the communities that we work in when we grew up in them. And now it would be remiss of us to think of it as, now that we're in a space, that we don't, not to use it in a way that amplifies what's happening in the communities that we're seeking to help. I think it's wrong, not wrong, but it might be inaccurate to say that defense attorneys don't community organize, or that they're not on the ground here, because I think that experience is different from me here. In my experience, or here in Dallas, defense attorneys, particularly defense attorneys of color that do work in Dallas County, do live in these communities, and so have a personal stake in what happens around services and around organizations in this city or in this county. The other part of that is that, in general, and larger conversations around policy and what's about to happen, is that the defense bar is usually left out, right? And all across the nation. The problem is, courts, prosecutors, cops get together and have conversations and leave out public defense officers, if you're lucky to have one. And if they don't have one, they leave out the private defense bar, instead of talking to this other portion of the legal community that's upholding public safety, regularly excluded from the conversation. And so I think that's why you see a lot of activism from defense attorneys, because if they can't be in the room in some places where you're actively being left out of policy decisions, then you're going to make sure you're heard some other kind of way, and that's usually around organizing. So I just wanted to make sure that, a shout out to those defense attorneys on the line who are actually on the ground community organizing, because they recognize that they're sometimes left out of the conversation or left out of the room when larger organizations are having discussions.
So I want to use my last question to ask you all. I'm going to go around and ask you all, what do you wish you had known going into this? And, this is really for the people that might be inspired by the work that you're doing and might want to organize in their own communities with their own legal networks. What do you wish you had known starting out?
Okay. I guess I wish I had known to be really prepared to be in it for the long game, to expect backlash and prepare for backlash. It's part of the way you're making waves. And to really, I wish that earlier on I had done my homework in terms of all the other groups that were already in this space. I really encourage lawyers who are, used to being at the microphone to back up, and to do a lot more listening and less talking, and take direction from community organizers and who are setting their own agendas. And so I guess I would say that I wish I was more realistic about the pace of change, but I also would encourage people to be prepared for windows of opportunity that you don't expect, like last summer's uprisings, which have led to opportunities to, be involved in the governor's task force on racial equity that I'm deeply involved in, and training more prosecutors and judges who are open to these conversations in a way that they weren't before. So those are some of the things I wish I'd known at the beginning, and that I encourage people to keep in mind.
I think for me, what I really wish and I probably did know this, I think adrenaline just pushed us a lot differently. I really wish I would have thought as the director to pace us a lot differently. to slow us down. We are an organization that was grieving and mourning while we were also trying to fight. And although we started incorporating self-care in our meetings, I think the first 15 to 20 minutes of every virtual meeting, we just went into virtual breakout rooms and just had conversation. We allowed one another to speak, and that actually ended up being very helpful because for many of us, that was the only time we were openly talking about things. And so if I could do anything different, because I think I knew to do this, but the adrenaline and the time just called for something very different. I wish I would have paced us to slow down, because not only were we joining for Power in Action, that our members were also joining with their own teams that work in community. We have a team, Faith in Texas. They were scheduled to go on break. And as soon as things started to change with the protests, that was gone. And so they never stopped working. And so to factor in, we have people that are already working really hard, that are carrying a lot professionally and personally, and then they show up for Power in Action as well. And then we go even harder when we're there. And so I wish I would have thought just to pace us a lot differently. This is definitely a marathon. This is definitely not a sprint. And this is more than a marathon, to be quite honest. And for us, it was about being just a little bit more kind to ourselves in this work, because it takes a lot out of you. And I know that we've been exhausted, and we've started to recognize that, and we've started to take intentional breaks, but it is still exhausting for us. So for me, it's just pacing and doing the work and spreading it out a lot differently.
So I think we're up against our hour. And so I'm going to pass it back over to my colleague, Monica Reed. Thank you so much for this discussion. You all are truly inspirational, and I hope the viewers are able to take some nuggets back home with them and maybe, grow something in their own jurisdiction. So thank you.